In this episode of Multifamily Talks, a RealPage podcast, I'm joined by Jennifer Cassidy, President of Property Operations and Experience with the Cardinal Group. Jen has a passion for people in the housing industry, so when she reached out to see if she could come on and talk about the loneliness crisis in America and the role she feels the housing industry can play in combating it, I knew we had to say yes. She truly has a spirit that is both passionate but also compassionate around solving the loneliness crisis so prevalent today, particularly in younger generations. It may sound a bit heavy on the surface, but I promise we keep it relatively light and there's so much we can all do. But enough of the intro. Let's get to the show. All right, Jen, number one, thank you for coming on and just talking with us. But I also want to say thank you for picking a topic that I thought was super interesting when you brought it to me. You reached out and just said, hey, I'd really love to come on and talk about the loneliness epidemic and what we can, and I'll say in multifamily and just use that very broadly, can do about it. I guess my first question is, how did this become the subject that you wanted to talk about? Like what was it that resonated with you about this?
Well, first of all, I love the outlet you have here to kind of reach our friends in multifamily. And so I think I had listened to one of your former recordings, and I know, you personally and that you're passionate about this. But for me, I can remember distinctly, it was October of 2021. I was in New York meeting with a client, and I got an email, like I often do, with an incident report from one of my communities about a suicide that had happened. And it kind of just stopped me in my tracks, the nature of it and how affected our manager was at the time. And I remember I called Eddie Moreno, who used to be with Cardinal, and I said, this is terrible, and I feel like we need to do more. And he kind of challenged me. He said, listen, I saw the student housing industry really come together to navigate the business aspects of the impact of the pandemic. How can you call on that group to do something about this? And so that was kind of the beginning of my passion for the topic. And I would tell you, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but 25 of the largest student operators now have come together to form a Mental Wellness Advocacy Coalition. So we represent about 850,000 college students. But when we first came together, just the staggering amount of feedback around the nature of the incidents that we were seeing on site, particularly right out of the pandemic in 21 and 22.
Yeah.
It was so alarming and such a shift for our on-site teams in this industry of, they're apartment managers, but honestly, to some degree, they're counselors, and they feel a heavy burden to connect with their residents and make sure that they're checking in on people and just really normalizing the discussion around what their jobs have become and how we can support them. Because when these things happen, they're always asking themselves, what could I have done differently? And then they're dealing with the grief and the impact of it as well. So it started there. And then, through this coalition and through working with a lot of my peers, I've been able to see how many resources are out there. It just doesn't feel like there's a consolidated enough approach to get information in front of people before they need it. And so, as anyone in business knows, nothing happens quickly, but we've made some progress. And I always remind myself that if we're just affecting one life, this is worth it. So I think there's a ton of work to be done, but I think our industry as a whole is really acknowledging that this is a problem and there's more that we can do to help contribute to people just living better lives.
So I got to be honest and transparent. I didn't know about the coalition until you brought the subject up, and I started doing some research on it. And it's definitely bigger than housing, and it's definitely bigger than just a pandemic thing brought on. Part of my research when I was going and looking, I did a really sophisticated Google search in the beginning of what is the loneliness epidemic? Because I'm relatively an introvert. I've lived my life on the road alone quite a bit on those things. I'm comfortable with it. But the Department of Health and Human Services has actually truly literally called it a pandemic or an epidemic. And even before COVID-19, they were saying that approximately half of U.S. adults reported to experience measurable levels of loneliness. Forgive me. And the Association of Health issues that go along with it. And I do want to go back and talk about it specific to student housing and in the young. But when we think about it from a overall population, I'm reading from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services report on this. It says the physical health consequences of poor or insufficient connection include a 29% increase in the risk of heart disease, 32% increased risk of stroke, a 50% increased risk of developing dementia for older adults. Additionally, lacking social connection increases risk of premature death by more than 60%. They actually equated it to the same health effect as if you smoked 15 cigarettes a day. Like, that's how big an issue this is for the country. So let's not to go too far back in time, but like, when I started in student housing way back in the day, we did experience we had one falling death and one suicide that was a matching one. They kind of mimicked it. So I've seen the impact of that on early staffs. Talk to me about how the coalition came to be. Like, how was it that this group of, you said 25 different operators, how did you start that conversation? Or maybe it wasn't you, but how did that conversation start around, hey, we've got to do something as a collective industry?
Yeah, so after that incident occurred, I came back home and I sent out an email to a couple of other leaders in the space that had been really active participants in these industry calls we were having in the pandemic to talk about things like how to properly sanitize units and, how people were handling certain issues. And I just said, we're seeing this across our portfolio. We're really struggling to figure out how do we best support our teams, and then what can we do proactively to prevent this? Is anybody else seeing this, and would you be interested in talking about it? And the first person to respond to me was Richie Lasik from Core Spaces, who's super passionate about it. And then slowly but surely, Casey Peterson from Peak and American Campus responded, and they said, hey, like, we have this partnership with Hi, How Are You, based out of Austin. And we would love to bring that partnership to the table, which obviously American Campus being so large and already having done some of the legwork in a partnership like this was a huge accelerant to kind of the direction that we wanted to go. So it started with a core group of, 5 or 6. And then obviously through each of our networks, we started reaching out and sort of formalized it more. And, it's most of the major groups that were saying, yeah, I'm seeing this too. How can we get involved? How can we help? So our initial effort was to partner with Ipsos, who's one of the most credible, survey companies, and survey students to find out what is the state of mental health amongst students and what can the students tell us about, how does connection to their community impact their mental health? And the 2022 survey was pretty staggering, honestly, in terms of just the rates in which students were reporting feeling stressed out all the time, feeling anxious and worried, overwhelmed. And so it was really a starting point to identify that the thing that they turned to the most when they were feeling down was music. And, how do we use music in the spaces that we have at our communities, and how much they valued access to natural light and being outdoors, and just little things that I think, you take for granted in terms of amenities or things that have really an ability to impact somebody. So it was pretty telling early on, and that's been good data for us to work with developers on in terms of what are the things they can be considering as they're
developing. I was just about to ask.
Yeah, and I will be honest, developers, I applaud, have been really, really interested in this data and really interested in looking at different partnerships and things that they can do to support students as well. And so that was our first big initiative, was the survey. We did another survey in 2023, and we actually saw some improvement in the data. So we are seeing that in the last 2 years, the number of students that are thriving are going up. The number of students that are reporting being happy all the time are going up. The overwhelm is going down. However, we had over 65% of the respondents tell us they feel stressed out all the time. They feel overwhelmed. And so it's pretty remarkable, the level of stress among students. And so we're really looking at this year, what are the methods in which we can connect with them, and really try to provide them resources as they're entering our communities or even before. So that, 3 months in, when the stress and the overwhelm really set in, it's like, oh, let me go reference that social media series on healthy habits, or let me go look at that QR code with those different numbers for resources that are available to me locally. Because I think part of the problem, what we know from the survey data, is that most students that are struggling do not know where to go for help or have never had mental health support in the past. And I think that is where we're seeing a lot of students kind of get lost and feel like there is nowhere to go for support.
That's right. So there's a lot to unpack in there, but and again, we're talking about this from the student housing perspective. I want to keep going and saying that this is not a student housing issue. This is a housing issue. I love the example that the lead that student has taken on trying to solve for some of these, or at least provide the resources that are in place. It's interesting with both my boys are in student housing currently. They're actually roommates with each other, but I've seen the what I would call the isolation that they go through because they're roommates together. There's nobody else in that room. They go in and out of their apartment. They've got fortunately a core group of friends now, but that certainly wasn't the case in the beginning, and it was super easy to isolate, quite honestly. You mentioned you were educating and training your staffs to not necessarily identify that, but provide opportunities to mitigate it if it's there. What kind of training and activities, et cetera, are you encouraging staff to do? Is it all about activity based? Are we doing any type of social training with the teams? Like what does that look like, if we can unpack that just a little bit?
Well, it's conversational too. And I think you and I chatted about this a little bit. So one of our big initiatives at Cardinal has been to deploy centralization. And a big part of the desire to do that was to give the on-site teams time back to actually connect with the residents. So if they're not, calling on delinquent late payments because the AI is able to do that for them, can they come out of their office, make eye contact with their resident and say, hey, how's your day going? Or did you know we're hosting this event? Is this something of interest to you? And so that is one of our big goals with centralizing certain tasks and roles on site. I don't know that there's, a magic answer in terms of like what activities will cause more connection. But what I do know is that in the last 20 years, we continue to bog the on-site team down with so many tasks that we've gotten away from the most important thing, which is how do you provide a great environment where your residents can thrive? And, I firmly believe that looks different at every community too. It's like where we have a community full of graduate students, connecting with them and understanding the type of programming they want to see versus a community full of underclassmen. You can't really know that unless you talk to them. And so some of the survey data has told us that obviously, and this is, I think we would assume this, but we know through the data that freshmen and sophomore are usually more at risk. They're, acclimating and still trying to figure it out. So how can we program for them things that are more likely to accelerate connection and socialization, whether that be, a campus walk to get familiar with where your classes are, or just a mixer to learn and meet new people in the building versus, some of our upperclassmen that might not need that same level of connection, but want certain types of programs. But I firmly believe that the on-site teams, if you give them the time back, they'll spend it on that piece. I think a lot of people get into multifamily because they are extroverted and they do want to talk to people. But the industry has been such in the last several years where it's really hard to get out from behind the desk and do that.
Well, and we talk about surveys and I want to acknowledge the fact that you haven't said it this way, but one of the things I think that you guys are doing very, very well in this is you're not going into it with the curse of knowledge. You're asking, like you're approaching them and asking them that ongoing survey. So I think that's a really, really key thing in this. One of the things I've always been thinking about with centralization or operational restructuring, there's lots of ways you can say it, is a lot of groups out there are measuring success of that by, are we reducing payroll? Are we reducing on that from an on-site perspective? I think what you hit on there, I think is really important is, you mentioned your goal is not necessarily a payroll reduction. Your goal is to actually free the teams up to do what is going to be best for the community, which is actually be a part of the community, get out from behind the desk. And you don't have to give me a specific answer because it might be part of the Cardinal secret sauce. I don't want to necessarily give any of that away, but how are you then measuring the success of that outcome? How are you measuring, are we touching more people at our community? Are we having better relationships? Or is it still something that's relatively, subjective as opposed to objective measurement?
Yeah, so we have scorecards that we put together when we deployed centralization on different roles. And so on account specialists, you would think those scorecards are totally focused on what is our collection, what is it at different times of the month. But another piece of it is, what is our Aura score? What is our retention of the community? Because we believe that if we have centralized collections deployed and we're giving the time back to the team, then that online reputation should go up because our residents are happy. Retention should go up because we're able to service their needs quicker. I think a piece of centralization too that doesn't get talked about enough is just how we can meet people where they're at. So, I know when we can't get the information we want, it's frustrating. We're so used to in this consumer world, like you go online, you go to Amazon, you have something at your doorstep the next day. And so what we were finding is our residents couldn't get what they wanted from our website, and they were either moving on, if it was a prospect or if it was a resident, they're coming in hot the next day, like, I need an answer to this question. No one's gotten back to me. And what we've seen through the AI is over 40% of our interactions are happening after the office is closed for the day or on the weekend, which means from a satisfaction standpoint, the residents getting what they want and their need to interact with us is less based on an issue or a question and more based on just being able to come in and socialize with the team. So I think reviews are a big piece of it. I feel grateful that we live in a world now where people, I believe, are more apt to provide reviews as for a good experience as they are for a bad, where that didn't always used to be.
Yeah, that was not always the case.
And so, we also use surveys to gauge our resident feedback. But the other piece of it is the staff, and how are we supporting the staff and how is the staff feeling equipped to do the things we're asking? Because, you said this with the survey earlier, it's like the curse of knowledge. And I certainly know, having started on site, now being at a corporate level, you roll things out and you think, well, of course this is going to work and it's going to work just like this. And then the team tells you, no, it's not, or no, it's not working that way. So we use Qualtrics twice a year, which I think is an amazing software to measure team member engagement. And, one of the questions in Qualtrics is there somebody at work that cares about my development or my success? And I think that's a great indicator of team member sentiment, as well as, do they feel equipped to do their role? Do they feel like they've had the training and they have the tools they need to be successful in their job? So it's not one thing. I think it's a lot of things. And I'm a big believer that you can't use point in time data. You have to look at the trends over time, especially as you're changing so much. But I think, I'm a fan of data. So the more data points we can have, the better we can feel about the changes we're making.
Okay, so you obviously measure success via data, but you don't institute cultural change via data. That's through experience. So I know you mentioned that kind of this all started with a singular point in time and a singular event back in October of 2021. How did you approach the cultural change? Did you take, I would imagine, probably a top-down approach to, hey, let's commit to this, let's do this. But how did you get that cultural change through an organization? We'll start with Cardinal first, through that organization relatively quickly. But now really, top 25, you're talking about pretty much a big portion of the student housing industry as well.
Yeah, what I can tell you is we're an innovative company and we change a lot, and some things are not easy to change. But when it came to the focus on mental health, it was like people were just waiting for us to say the words out loud that this is important. The number of on-site team members that reached out and just said, we're so proud and happy that we work for an organization that is acknowledging this is a problem and wants to help do something about it. It was pretty overwhelming just to even hear some of the stories of our team members that had been impacted directly through, the loss of a family member from suicide, or, a spouse or a friend that had attempted suicide. So I would say it was overwhelmingly like, what can I do? How can I contribute to this? it is certainly daunting at a big national level and at scale to create continuity and consistency with how you approach this from community to community. But I think like anything else, every community kind of has a personality of its own. So the goal is
Sure.
to provide structure, but then let them make it their own in terms of what works well for them and their teams and their residents.
And I would imagine a big part of it is simply giving your teams permission to step away from the desk, go have a conversation, and actually set the expectation that we connect with the people on our properties. Like that, I'm sure that was a huge part of it.
Yeah, and also drawing the line for them of we don't expect you to be a counselor. And also, if you're not comfortable doing something, it's not an expectation of your job. But here's how we can provide you with some framework just to help you in your day to day. So one of the big things I'm really excited about is within the next month, we're launching a postvention toolkit that we partnered with the JED Foundation to create. So JED typically works with universities on campus. And so we brought them in, and this is really a guide to how to handle crisis on site. And so one of our commitments was we have to support our teams, and we have to put some support and materials out for our staff before we focus on residents, because we're big believers that one, in student housing, your staff are your residents. And two, the staff is so deeply impacted by this. And so that's coming out here in the next month. And I hope that, for the teams on site, they'll feel like they have a good framework for how they deal with these things. I mean, everything from what do you do initially to, how do you look for support when you have to make that phone call to a parent or, a guardian when someone's stuff is in a room that has to be emptied out. Just the things that, our teams deal with that you don't think about at the macro level, but are hugely impactful.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, having started in the student way back in the day, we were given training and we role played it and everything else on how to deal with the crisis. We were never given anything on how to deal with the aftermath. And I mean, the reason I can tell you exactly what happened, 30 years ago now. Yeah, literally 30 years ago. No, 32 years ago. Sorry, doing math in my head. It still sticks with me. Like it still very much sticks with me. And it was ironic that you were talking about, how ACC jumped in, et cetera. At the time I was working for Steve Crawford. Like he was my resident manager way back then. But how, again, we're dealing with crisis. What kind of attention to how to deal with the aftermath have you guys thought about with the teams, if any at all?
I mean, that's what this postvention toolkit is focused on, is how do you respond? And, how can you leverage support through that process? Because a lot of times that stems from a community manager raising their hand and saying, I need help. And it's more about how can we put a process in place where we're not relying on somebody to raise their hand, that we know and we can activate support anytime something happens, because sometimes people don't raise their hand. And, I've connected with managers when things have happened, and it could be weeks after, and they've shared, this was deeply impactful because I lost a parent to suicide, things you just wouldn't know. And so, the materials are really designed to take them kind of step by step through what to do, and then how to leverage support, how to, make sure people know what you're going through. It was interesting because the JED Foundation, I think, learned a lot too about the off-campus world. We did a small focus group. Each of us picked a manager, each management company, and the managers were able to share some of the experiences of what they were dealing with on site. And I think that really helped in terms of how to design these materials and what, the off-campus world is dealing with. But I think it was very enlightening for them as well. And oftentimes the universities just don't have the resources to extend off campus. But the reality is in most, university markets, 80% of the population is not living on campus.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Yeah. It was interesting because this conversation's gone a different direction than I thought it was going to go, which I love when that happens. It's some of my favorite stuff with these things. but I do want to come back and keep reemphasizing the fact that yes, we're talking about student housing, but this problem is not isolated to student housing. This is a nationwide problem. And it may just be that I've been a data guy for so long and these aren't the conversations I have with operators. I haven't heard people in the multifamily space talking about this. That doesn't, I'm not saying that they're not doing that. It just, I haven't been privy to it. So it's been pretty interesting. What I do want to do though is I'm gonna go a little bit off script with you, Jen, and again, the Department of Health and Human Services actually came through with essentially 6-step plan as to ways that we can help battle the loneliness epidemic. Because it's great we're talking about the aftermath and how do we deal with the crisis, et cetera. But ultimately, we want to focus on how do we prevent it to begin with, and how do we bring that. So, I'm gonna read these 6 to you one at a time, and I'll just be curious to get your on the spot thought of, okay, how could housing potentially have an opportunity to impact in this way? And I don't think you're gonna have an answer for all of these, by the way, but a couple of them definitely. So, like the number one thing is strengthening social infrastructure. I'm not gonna read you all the definitions of what that is, but when you think about in a housing perspective, where's the opportunity to strengthen social infrastructure?
Yeah, I think, in multi as well, the programming, the events, we manage build to rent too. And so,
Yeah.
I think 90% of what we do in all of these asset classes is the same, right? And so it's like, how do you program to the profile of your community? So in BTR, we're doing, family picnics or gift wrapping events at the holidays, or, a back to school event for kids. I think it's just giving people a reason to leave their apartment and connect with others. And yes, connect with our team, but really just providing those opportunities to socialize within the community.
Yeah. And I want to go back to something you said at the beginning, because I think it's super important, is thinking about it from the development stage. Like of how are we building spaces within our buildings and communities that encourage that? I recently moved about a year and a half ago, and I look at the neighborhood I came from that was, we were in for 20 years versus where we're at now. And they're very similar as far as structures, with the exception of one thing. It is the dog walking path that goes around the entire neighborhood. And that is such a point of social connection in this new neighborhood that never existed in the other one, which did have a walking path, but it was tucked way away from everything. I'm sure somebody walked on it. I don't know who they were. But it's important to know that.
Well, and if you look at multi too, I think we've seen really what I think is really cool is these WeWork spaces that are getting put into some developments. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I work from home. Working from home can be very isolating. Even when you're on video calls all day long, sometimes you just need a change of scenery. You want to be around people. So I love that we're starting to see these kind of shared workspaces pop up in multifamily. I think, like you said, it's not a unique to student housing problem. And I think developers really are paying attention to that.
Yeah. And that's really, really, really good to hear. I would say that the next couple are definitely not things that multifamily and housing is going to be like. It's enact pro-connection public policies. We're not setting any public policies. Mobilizing the health sector, obviously that's not us. But one you and I talked about earlier that I think does have an effect within housing is reforming digital environments. We talked off camera a little earlier about, the experiences of our kids and that disconnection that social is creating. Or at least certainly exacerbating. How do you think about the connection within things like the Resident app? Like, what are the thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this all the time, and I'll give you an anecdote. My son is a huge Disney fan. And so we were
Kid after my own heart.
People until 2019, and then COVID hit, and we just went back last year and talk about like centralizing and just using digital to upgrade. And I think what Disney's done is amazing. I mean, the mobile ordering and the reservations, you don't buy your ticket at the gate anymore, but I'm on my phone all day long. I have to book my ride on my phone. And if I want to see photos, I'm on my phone. And so it's really like, I think it's the same in multi. People want the convenience of the information at their fingertips, but you know how it is. As soon as you pick up your phone to do anything, you see all the notifications that have come in from everything else. So I don't think that's an issue we've solved. I think we keep moving to more and more digital. And so, one of the things I've thought about is how do we use those platforms to encourage good habits. And so, partnering with potentially apps like Calm, or one of our development partners using an app called Counselor. And so how could you potentially link those things through the resident portal? But I think, our residents want the convenience of the app. There's no doubt about that. Nobody wants to go back to manual, but how do you potentially encourage good habits through that? I think is the real opportunity.
Yeah, when I read this the first time, I was like, that's an area that, because not every group is a Cardinal that has their own development team and those types of things, but that's an area for us in the vendor space to be able to say, okay, how do we consider that when we're looking at all of these, the user experience, and that it's not just about, or potentially could not just be about, are we easy to do business with? Like, are we really truly helping develop community, et cetera? The fifth one really, actually, no, I take that back. The fifth one actually does, I think, pertain to multifamily. And it's interesting because it's deep in our knowledge. It's basically become aware of the issue and then continue to dig in. And it sounds like with the studies and everything that you're doing, the housing councils are kind of working towards that.
Yeah, and I think too at the individual community level, like we're encouraging our teams to do programs that raise awareness. One of the biggest takeaways in the survey was the more the community talks about mental health, the more confident I feel about talking about my own mental health. And that's just destigmatizing it, right? And so I think, whether it's, a lot of our Class A new developments now are having meditation rooms or yoga rooms. And so part of it is like, can we do some social media, not just highlighting the amenity, but highlighting how you can use that amenity for better mental health and how that encourages better mental health. So yeah, I think at the community level, we've seen a lot of great examples of how they're talking about it in a productive way where it's making it more normal for people to share.
Okay. And then the last one that they have on here of the 6 is another interesting one, I think, especially again in multifamily. And I think this is I think you can do a 2-pronged approach on this one. It's cultivate a culture of connection. How do you think that we can help within that?
Yeah, like I do, you can tell within 5 minutes of walking into a community if that exists. We have a community in St. Louis where the property manager knows everyone's dog's name and she knows their schedules, and she purposely walks out of her office at a certain time of the day with dog treats. And I think she really sets the example. And then you see the residents connecting with each other and using spaces together, like the dog park or, the clubhouse or things like that. So I really think what we've tried to do is educate our teams on all of the benefits of that. Because, I know you and I had talked years ago in terms of revenue management, like you'll have these communities that just get these rents that defy logic. And it's like, it's the intangible at that community of people just really feel connected to each other. They feel like the staff really cares about their experience. And so, I think, and I say this all the time, as a property manager, that's the best thing you could possibly do is create that sense of connection for somebody at their home.
Yeah, I completely concur. And that's where I was thinking that connection, I saw from kind of twofold. I saw it from your point, the connection to the residents, et cetera, but I was also thinking about what you guys have done in Cardinal, which is that connection within as well, the connection of the teams to corporate and connecting it to the overall goal. Okay, so a couple just last things as we wrap this up. And again, thank you for coming on and doing this conversation, because I've really, really enjoyed bringing this. For someone who's listening to this, maybe they're a student operator and they said, wait a minute, I didn't know about this coalition. How can people find out more about what's going on and how to potentially become a part of it?
Yeah, well, they can reach out to me directly.
I wasn't going to give your contact information out directly.
We do have a website. I believe it's thrivingcollegestudents.org. So that's the website for the coalition. For any student industry team members that are attending Interface next week, we'll have a roundtable on the first night, just educating more. And then one of the next big initiatives of the coalition is to do some fundraising. So if it's a vendor partner, absolutely reach out. We're really excited about opportunities to partner and to be able to do more for our residents and our team. And obviously that requires funding. So definitely more to come there.
Well, good. And the tech guys always love it when I do this. We're going to put that in the show notes. I have no idea how we actually do that, but we'll get the link in the show notes for everybody. So one last question that I ask everyone, and considering the stack that is sitting on your right-hand side right now, I'm excited to hear the answer on this one, because the black one there is one of my favorites. If you were to recommend one book to someone who's coming up in the industry, what would that one book be? What's the one that you think has the most impact, and why, obviously?
Oh, that's such a hard question for me. So before I answer that question, I'm going to say I just read the book Connectable. And so when you talk about loneliness, I think it's important to share this. That book was so impactful to me in terms of how we help with loneliness at work. It was really, really insightful and eye-opening about how you can make the difference in someone's experience, especially as a new team member to an organization. I joined Cardinal after 15 years somewhere else, didn't know what it was going to be like. And those first 6 to 12 months, I think, are really, you're just trying to navigate your way. And this book just gave so many tips about how you can be a great teammate and the little things that you can do, especially in a remote environment, to reach out to people. So I would say, relevant to the topic of loneliness, if you haven't read Connectable, read it. But I struggled with which one. I'm going to go with Daring Greatly. I'm a huge Brené Brown fan. And I think the thing that I liked about that book the most is that she encourages you towards the end to pick kind of your 3 words, like your real leadership values. And I think if you're coming up in the industry and you want to grow and you want to become a leader, it's important to know who you are as a leader. I think, I spent many years thinking I want to be that person. And it took me a long time to realize I don't want to be that person. I want to be the best version of me. And so, like, what are the values that I really resonate with? And then how can I have the most impact on the people around me? So Daring Greatly, Brené Brown.
I love it. And I have read that one. I haven't read Connectable, although I do know what to look for now because it's on the bottom of the stack over there if you haven't noticed it, from those of you on the video. Jen, again, thank you so much. Appreciate the passion you have for this topic, the passion you have for the industry, and just the person that you are. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Multifamily Talks, a RealPage podcast. As always, the views expressed are those of the individuals participating and not those of RealPage.